Whether you call them blooms, backgrounds, or cauliflowers, these are really beautiful watercolor effects. They can also be really annoying if you get them in the wrong place, but today we're going to look on them positively, and we're going to snatch success from the jaws of defeat, and we're going to show you 8 ways that you can actually use these effects to make specific objects and surfaces within your watercolor paintings. Now, if you haven't yet learned how to make these, I'll show you that to start with. So we're going to quickly cover how you make this effect happen, and then I'm going to show you some practical applications for it that are really going to bring your paintings to life. Welcome back to my channel. If you haven't found me before, my name is Michelle, and on this channel we do all things watercolor as well as drawing tutorials, mixed media, even a little bit of motivation too. Please do consider subscribing, it's completely free. I make at least one free video a week here on YouTube with extra color mixing content for channel members. So before I show you these 8 different ways of using these effects in real life painting applications, we must first understand why and how they form. This will not only help you with this video, but it'll help you if you need to avoid these things, because a bloom or a cauliflower or a back run is only a mistake when it's in the wrong place. And the reason they form is some very simple physics. Let me show you what makes it happen so that you can replicate it or avoid it every single time. So what causes a back run or a bloom to happen? It's pretty predictable actually. You may have made them by mistake, and I know exactly how it happened. What happened was you had a puddle of paint that was next to paint that was wet, but not as wet as that puddle of paint. It's basically physics. The paint, the water, is trying to seek a level, and so it's going to spread out from that area of thicker paint, if you like, to an area where the paint is spread thinly. So let's make one happen. So I'm going to wet the paper, and I'm going to wait a moment. Now, bear in mind that YouTube videos are edited, and the way to succeed on YouTube is not to have paint drying on camera. So how long you wait depends on how warm it is. It's pretty hot here in the UK at the moment. We have just reached summer. Now I'm going to take some paint that's wet, wetter than the surface it's going onto. And here we are. This is what happens. Our little blooms spread outwards. Now, at any time in this video when I'm using paint, I could be using clean water. In other words, I have put paint onto clean water, but I could equally put clean water onto paint. It makes no difference. You'll still get some kind of bloom happen. And now we're going to use these to make all sorts of cool things. So now that's out the way, let's learn how to use these to make some very beautiful effects, and we're going to start with some petals. So I've drawn a couple of petals on this paper. We'll look at the yellow one in a moment, but let's start with this one here. I've drawn a lily petal. Now, on many lilies, you get a real sort of bloom of colour spreading out in little feathery edges along the middle. So that's what we're going to do. Now, you never want the bloom to go off the edge of the water, so we're going to take it out much further than we actually want it to go. I'm going to take this water right out to the edge of the petal. Now, I'll be careful not to take it outside of the edge of the petal because the paint can't spread where there isn't water. We don't want any colour accidentally going outside of our lily petal. Again, we let it get semi-dry. I rather like that bright pink. It's the permanent rose from my essentials set. So let's take some of that colour up the middle here. Can you see wherever I stop, it's kind of going out in a circle. So you can manipulate this a little bit until you get it looking just how you want it. Let's make this petal look even more realistic by adding a few dots and a centre line in watercolour pencil. Now see how the paint has spread here. If I don't want that little bit of paint spreading, all I do is clean and dry my brush, and I can use my brush just to lift out a little bit of pigment so I get exactly the result I want. Now, what about the yellow petal? I painted this one earlier, so it's dry, which means we can now put this effect on top of colour. Now, to be clear, you could do this at the same time, but you'll get much more blending of the paint together, and perhaps you just don't want to have to work that fast. So I'm going to put clean water on. Again, I'm covering the whole petal, and the reason for that is that just water alone can sometimes leave a drying line. So if I stop halfway up, we might be able to see that line, and the paint might accidentally come off of that edge. So this is more like a tulip petal, and I want the colour to be at the base here. So I'm going to take it down here, and perhaps I'll bring it up the middle. As I said, it's rather warm here in the UK today, so this underneath colour is already drying. It's looking a little unnatural, so I rinse and dry my brush, and then I can just blend it a little and place it where I want. These petals often have a centre line, which we could do with a watercolour pencil, or I can just drag the paint up. It's important that you don't mess around with them for too long, past the point where the paint is starting to dry. Now, as well as petals and botanical painting, you can also use this effect to make groups of flowers or give the impression of flowers, whereby each of these little cauliflowers is a single flower by itself, or indeed arranged in a group of flowers. So let's make some flowers next. So let's get the impression this time of lots of small flowers. I'm going to put a little bit of green here, just so they've got a bit of background. And we'll fill in this gap here with clean water. Now I'm using the pink again here, but I've got it quite strongly mixed. So it's still wet, but there's a lot of pigment in it. Because pink and green are opposite colours, so we don't want to dull our pink down too much by making it too weak. And here I can just get an impression of perhaps a bush of flowers growing in a garden. Down here I've put some dots of masking fluid. You may not be able to see them, but you'll see them in a moment. And I'm going to wet the paper again. I've mixed more of a magenta colour this time, and let's place it near the masking fluid. And here we get a different look. I'll let this one dry and then show you what happens when we take the masking fluid off. So it's all dry now. Let me take an eraser across this and remove the masking fluid. I can keep it like this, or if I want to, I can add a little colour to my flower centres. You can use all sorts of combinations of colours to give an impression of flowers growing in a garden or a landscape. Now this effect is great for making things grow, such as grasses. However, we don't want them to grow out sort of as a big circle. I'm going to show you how to arrange where you put the water so that the grasses always grow up and stay exactly where you want them. This is fantastic for making realistic looking grasslands. Where I live in the UK, there are lots of meadows. I use this technique all of the time. So let's see how it works. So far we've allowed our blooms to just spread out in a circular motion and then adjusted them slightly with the paintbrush. What if we just want them to grow out in one direction? We just manipulate where we place the water. So I've got a line here. I want to grow some grass or some foliage upwards. So I'm going to put the water above the line but not below it. Again, we give it a moment or two to dry. Now I can run a paintbrush of wet paint along my paper and things are growing upwards. The water's still quite wet, which is why it's gone so far up and why you need to take that water a long way above where you're expecting the bloom to go, maybe 50% or more. Now, because this has gone a bit looser than I wanted, all I've got to do is repeat the process. I'm just going to wait a moment and we'll take another layer down here, a slightly darker colour this time. And again, we're growing our foliage up and out from that base line. This is so effective for landscape painting. Now let's do it on this dry area here. So if we imagine this was a little foreground in a landscape, I'm going to take some clean water across the top. You want to do this quite gently so you don't disturb the underneath layers too much. Again, I'm going in with my paint. Now I could have wet just above the line. That will work too. But I can also just manipulate the paint so that it's mostly going upwards. And let's have some more down here. Can you see it's already started to dry here? So I'm just adding a bit more water. And instantly we're giving texture and interest to our landscapes. Let's get a little bit of green on there. It's gone rather blue, hasn't it? That'll be the blue doing that. I think I'm a genius sometimes, really. And there we have our impression of grass growing, instantly giving interest to our landscapes. At this point, if you're enjoying this video and getting some value from it, can I ask you please quickly just to click the thumbs up, the like button. If you like, share, subscribe to the channel, which is free, or leave me a comment. It helps the YouTube algorithm to push me out to more people, and I can teach more people how to paint in watercolors. So what else grows and is fluffy? Of course, it's fur. This technique is absolutely fantastic for getting fluffy, furry animals. Again, you'll need to be specific about where you place the water. So let's learn to do this next. So I've drawn half a cat here. He's a bit like the Cheshire cat. He appears a little bit at a time. And I've drawn the top part of a bird. Now, animals like this, they tend to have this kind of very sharply defined edge until they don't. And then they have an area that's kind of fluffy. The same with birds. They can be very crisp when you paint them, but they also may have some looseness, some soft fluffiness of the feathers around the top of the head, perhaps under the beak, maybe on the bottom of their belly. They have a soft fluffy area. So I'm going to show you how you can get this effect by using blooms. Now we're going to do it in two ways. So with the cat, we're going to paint the face of the cat and allow the feathering to go outwards as if we're painting on a white background. But with the bird, we're going to do the opposite. We're going to paint the background and allow the feathery parts to appear before we've even painted the bird, which is going to make painting the bird so much easier. And if you're thinking, I don't even know what you're talking about, Michelle, I find that with myself sometimes. Right, so I'm going to put water just in places here. So I want the cat to be a little bit soft around this area here. I'm just grabbing some sort of random grey paint here just to show you how we would do it. So I'm going to come around the edge here. So here I'm painting on dry paper. There's dry paper outside of the cat, and so I'm going to get that nice crisp edge. Now sooner or later I'm going to come down here and I'm going to start hitting that area of wet paint, and you can see what happens. We now have a cat that's got some fluffiness to him around certain areas, but has a crisp edge in other places. Now let's do the opposite of the bird. Let's paint a background to the bird and let's leave some fluffy areas. So I want the fluffiness to be here at the top of the head and also here under the beak. And we'll start taking a nice natural green background around him. Now don't worry if the paint goes too far into the bird, we can fix that in a moment. I'm going to go a little darker as well so you can see the effect. I'm going to clean this area up a tiny bit, like so, and then I'm going to manipulate this fluffiness by adding more water. So I'm adding the water inside the bird, and from there it will spread out in another back run. We're going to keep adding this clean water inside of the bird and allowing it to bleed outwards. So you can see now that when we come to paint our bird, we've got a nice crisp edge here around the beak and around certain areas. But where we want the feathers to be fluffy and to be coming outwards, we've already got this nice soft edge. And as it dries, you can continue to manipulate that even further by adding more clean water if you want it to be even more fluffy in those areas. And in this way, we can get soft, fluffy animal hair and soft, fluffy feathers. You will, of course, need to work these up in more layers. I have other videos on this channel all about painting birds and animal fur, so you can see how to work on top of this and to capitalize on these blooms to make realistic animals. When kept very small, these effects can look like little starbursts. I like to use them when painting rocks because you often get things like lichen growing on rocks. You can also use this technique for things like bricks. Let's make some lichen next. Here I've painted a rock and I've allowed it to dry. Things that are really solid like rocks, they really look good with several layers of paint. So I'm going to add another layer in here, just lightly coloured, and that's going to add to the solidity of this rock. Now we're going to grow some lichen on this rock, or some moss. And this works just as well for things like old brick walls as well. Sometimes you get that kind of white stuff blooming out on brick walls, so you could just use clean water. I'm going to use some yellow-green paint, and I'm just going to spot it in like this and get a really natural effect. This also, of course, works for many other textures like animal fur or eggshell. There are many things that you can use this layering technique for to build up texture and organic growth. Now, as well as specific items, we can use this technique as a background technique. We can indicate an idea, perhaps of some brightly coloured flowers, or just use it as an abstract, loose technique for backgrounds. Let me show you the way that I use this technique in the backgrounds of my own paintings. So let's use blooms and backgrounds in a much looser way. Now you can, as I showed you earlier, use them to get sort of background effects in garden painting. Let's do something a little bit more romantic. Let's put some colours behind this heart. I'm going to start on clean water here just so that I don't get too much of an edge where I start. And I'm just going to drop some colours in. So we're going to do sort of one layer of paint here for this background. Let's get some blue in. As we continue to paint round, the bit down here will start to dry, so I can go back then and manipulate it with either paint or clean water. And sometimes if you're having trouble getting a background that's completely smooth and even, it's almost easier just to give up on that idea and really just allow some backgrounds to form on purpose. So I'm going to go around here. Now, as I come down here, this side's starting to dry. So I think what I'll do is I'll go back up that side. Let's get some red this time. And I'm just going to drop some in. Let's paint a little more background. We can get some really beautiful effects. So we talked about grasses, but you can also use this technique for distant trees. And the best thing of all is you can drop it in as you're doing your sky. This works so well for landscapes. So let's make some distant trees. So we grew some grass earlier. We can do the same in a landscape with distant trees. So I've got a landscape drawn here, just a simple one with a little river. And I'm going to put the distant trees in whilst the sky is still wet. So we'll just do a simple sky, but you can do this with any kind of sky. It's taking some colour across here. Let's go a little darker up the top. And then what I'll do is I'll go in with a little bit of wetter paint down here by the horizon line. You want to vary the colours a little bit and the shapes. Now, once you've done this effect, you can leave it as is, or you can use this kind of almost as a background layer to some shapes in the foreground that may be done on drier paper. But look how simple and easy and effective it is. Don't forget to have everything ready before you start, because you don't want to be scrapping around looking for some green paint while your sky is rapidly drying. You need to put this in quickly and then leave it alone. Now, you can paint soft edged clouds and you can paint crisp edged clouds. But if you allow certain areas of the cloud shape to bleed out into the sky, so this time we'll be using clean water to make this effect rather than paint, you can get the effect of distant rain, or just an idea that there is perhaps a little bit of showeriness going on. I often need this technique, of course, when painting landscapes in the UK, because we get a lot of rain. So let's make some rain clouds. I've drawn some shapes on here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put clean water inside them, and I'm not actually going to be very neat about it because I want to touch this clean water almost accidentally. So the water's going inside the cloud shapes, but I'm not being too neat with it. What we'll do next is we'll paint the sky, and this will give us some crisp edged shapes, but just occasionally that sky colour is almost certain to hit some of this water, and we're going to get some lovely rainy effects. So let's start at the top. I've mixed quite a rainy sort of colour here, and I'm just going to bring it down evenly, and then I'm going to roughly go around those cloud shapes like so. Skies are usually a little lighter towards the horizon, so I'll just water that colour down as I come down. Get rid of any little bits of white paper there. So I think that's looking pretty good. You can lift out any white with a damp brush if it's gone a little bit too far. Clean up any areas. You can also add more clean water if you would like any more bleeding to happen, and get a nice idea of a loose, rainy sky. So I'd love to know in the comments, because I'm always learning myself, I'd love to know if you have any examples of places where you use these techniques. I hope you've learned some new techniques today. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in the video description. I've got lots of free stuff down there for you. You can also find out about all of my online courses. And if you're interested in more help all around colour mixing, do click the join button. It won't commit you to anything until you've had a read. It'll just tell you about my channel memberships, where you can get extra videos each week, all about pigments and colour mixing. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you're going to enjoy this other watercolour painting video. You can watch that one right now.